A lot of parents unintentionally turn a would-be logical consequence into a punishment, and then they wonder why their child reacts uncooperatively. So to be sure that you're giving a logical consequence and not a punishment, we want to follow those guidelines. And it may seem like a lot to remember at first, but as you practice it, it's going to become more like second nature to you. And these guidelines are to, one, ask your child to help decide the consequence, and two, put the consequence in the form of a choice, an either or choice or a when and then choice. So either this or that, or when you do this, then that happens. So make sure that the consequence is logically connected to the misbehavior. Give choices that you can live with and keep your tone of voice firm and calm. Give the choice one time and then enforce the consequence. And we got to expect testing. It's going to get worse before it gets better. We know that. And allow your child to try again after experiencing the consequence. So let's go back to the first one here, asking your child to help decide the consequence. Since the active style of parenting is based on respect and participation, it's wise to ask your child to help decide the consequence of their misbehavior. You stand a much better chance that your child is going to cooperate with you if you include them in the decision-making process. You might also be surprised how often they come up with choices and consequences that you wouldn't have thought of on your own. Then on the other hand, kids are going to often respond with typical punishments like grounding, push-ups, and things like that, rather than the logical consequence. So you need to explain the concept of logical consequences is a tool to help them learn, not a punishment to make them sorry. So for example, hey Katie, I still have a problem with you leaving all your things all over the house. What do you think we can do to help you remember to clean up after yourself? And even if the child doesn't give you any helpful suggestions or is uncooperative about finding a solution, it's important that you ask. Since you've invited her participation, she's going to be less likely to think of you as a dictator and to rebel against the consequence. Then we want to put the consequence in the form of a choice. Logical consequences teach responsibility, and that means choices plus consequences. So always present your logical consequence in the form of a choice. Your child can choose positive behavior with a naturally occurring positive consequence, or they can choose to misbehave and have you provide a logical consequence. So we can try one of these types of choices. Either blank or blank, you decide. Or the when and then. When you have blank, then you may blank. So when you have eaten your dinner, then you may have dessert. Either or choices are best used when you want to influence your child to stop a negative behavior. So if Katie leaves her stuff scattered around the house in the afternoon, Katie, either put your things away when you come home from school or I'll put them in a box in the basement. You decide. Notice that the logical consequence of leaving her belongings lying around is an inconvenience to having to dig them out of a junk box in the basement. So maybe Carter regularly forgets to put his dirty clothes in the hamper. You could say, Carter, either put your dirty clothes in the hamper or wash them yourself. You decide. In this example, the logical consequence of Carter continuing to leave his dirty clothes on the floor is the work of doing his own laundry. When and then choices, they're best used when you want to influence your child to start a positive behavior. They take two events that already occur and order them so that the child must do what you want them to do before they're allowed to do what they want to do. It's not a bribe or a reward because both behaviors are a normal part of the child's life already. So if Selena has trouble getting her homework done but likes to surf the internet. So if it's a yes, Selena, when you finish your homework, then you may play on the internet. No, Selena, if you do your homework, you may use the computer an hour longer than usual tonight. That last one is a reward, not a logical consequence, because it offers the child something extra for a task that they should be doing anyway. Remember, that rewards tend to become expected as a right, so we do not recommend using them. Tom's about to go to the swimming pool, but he ignored his regular Saturday chore of mowing the lawn. So what we want to say is, Tom, when you've mowed the lawn, then you may go swimming. What we don't want to say is, Tom, you may not go swimming until you have mowed the lawn, because then it becomes a reward. By putting it in a negative like that, the parent makes it sound like a threat. And since threats tend to lead to power struggles, we don't recommend that parents use them. We want to make sure the consequences are really logical. Logical consequences must be logically connected to the child's misbehavior, or else they're just punishments presented as a choice. Kids in a democratic society are very sensitive to injustice, whether it's real or perceived. When your consequence is logical, they're going to be much more likely to see it as fair, even if they complain. So what's not logical? Either come to dinner when I call you or lose the privilege of watching TV for a week. The logical choice would be either come to dinner when I call you or eat it cold. A not logical thing to say would be either share the computer with your brother or you're not going out on Saturday. You could say either share the computer with your brother or neither of you are going to be able to use it tonight. Not logical, finish your homework or you're grounded. Logical, when you finish your homework, then you may play the video game for a half an hour. Here's a tip though. There are a lot of logical consequences that are going to work for any given problem, but thinking of them doesn't always come easily, especially if you're accustomed to using a few basic punishments like grounding for every problem. With practice, the logical consequences are going to become a little bit more easy for you to think of. And it's going to help you to brainstorm those logical consequences for specific problems with your partner or a close friend or with other parents. Lastly, we want to give, or not lastly, but number 4 is to give choices where you can live, that you can live with. So if you give your child a choice, you have to be willing and able to live with the consequences of whichever choice that they make. And if you're not comfortable with the consequence, you're likely going to undermine it. So it's not going to be effective. So for example, in this active parenting group, a mother suggested the logical consequence for a problem that she was having with her son. Either put your dishes in the dishwasher or I will let them sit in the sink until you do. And so the group leader wisely asked the parent if she could live with a sink full of dirty dishes, at which point the mother admitted that it would drive her crazy. So the group helped her come up with a better consequence for the misbehavior, one that she could live with. Either put your dirty dishes in the dishwasher or anyone in the family can do it for you and you can pay them $2 each time for this service. You decide. Another parent solved that same problem with another logical consequence. Either put your dirty dishes in the dishwasher or when we run out of clean dishes, I'll serve dinner without them. And it only took one dinner of spaghetti and meatballs served on a bare table to teach the lesson. Of course, not many parents could live with that consequence, but it goes to show that there are a lot of possible logical consequences that a parent can think of. So be creative and be patient and do what feels right for you and your family. The 5th one is to keep your voice firm and calm. Whenever you give a choice, and later when you enforce those consequences, it's important that you remain calm and use a firm tone of voice. An angry tone of voice, that's the autocratic parent's pitfall, that invites rebellion and a fight. And at the other end of the spectrum is the wishy-washy tone, the permissive parent's pitfall. And that tells your child that you don't really mean what you say, which also invites rebellion. A firm and calm tone by an authority figure says, I'm going to treat you respectfully, but you're out of bounds here. My job is to help you learn to stay in bounds, and I plan on doing my job. The 6th one is to give the choice one time and then act. So for a logical consequence to be effective, you have to enforce it. If your child continues to misbehave after you've given them the choice, immediately follow through with the consequence. Do not give the choice a second time or a third or a fourth time without putting the consequence into effect. If you continue to repeat yourself, you're just training the child to ignore you until you're angry. Your child has to see that their choice results in a consequence and that you mean what you say. You don't want to be harsh about it, but you don't want to consistently enforce, we do want to consistently enforce that consequence. So, for example, here, if your books were in the kitchen when I clean, then you will find them in the junk box in the basement. And here, number 7 is expect testing. And no, I'm not talking about pop quiz or, on the contents of whatever this lesson is. I'm talking about the kind of testing that your child is likely to do to see if you're really going to follow through with the logical consequence if they continue to misbehave. Kids are going to test to see if we're consistent. So expect that the misbehavior may even get worse before it gets better. And if you consistently enforce the consequence that you set, in time, your child is going to see that their testing isn't weakening you, and at that point, they're probably going to improve their behavior. After all, kids don't do what doesn't work. But until then, try to avoid getting angry if your child tests you. Just continue enforcing the consequence firmly and calmly. And a tip here, in some cases, you might observe that your consequence just doesn't matter much to your child. And that's not testing. It's a form of informal deal making. So, for example, when Jared hits his little brother, his mother enforces the logical consequence of sending him to his room for an hour. She reasons that this is a logical consequence because if Jared can't be around other people without hitting, then he shouldn't be around other people at all for a period. But while he's in his room, Jared thinks, being in my room isn't so bad. I have my Legos, my crayons, my action figures. What else could I need? Plus, that little brat really gets on my nerves, and he deserved a good smack. All in all, I'd say the price is well worth it. And if you suspect that your child is not motivated by the consequence that you've set, then you're either going to need to find a different consequence or attack the problem in other ways, a family meeting or a FLAC method. The 8th one is to allow your child to try again later. And since we want our child to learn from the consequences of their choice, give them the chance to try again after they've experienced the logical consequence. So, for example, Sandra has agreed to do her chores on Saturday before watching TV. On Saturday morning, her dad notices that Sandra's chores are still not done, and she's parked in front of the TV watching her favorite show. So we could say, Sandra, I noticed that you haven't done your chores yet. We agreed you do them before watching TV. That means no more TV today. You can try again tomorrow. And if Sandra does her chores before tomorrow, she can watch her TV show then. If she doesn't, then she'll have to continue living without the TV. You might want to increase the length of time before the child gets to try again each time that they repeat the misbehavior. So logical consequences, they're going to take a little bit of practice to get used to and more practice to do well. And if you find yourself having trouble coming up with the appropriate logical consequences, try brainstorming with a spouse or a significant other or a friend. And if you find that your child is slow to respond to your logical consequence, check it against the 8 guidelines to see if you're accidentally turning a logical consequence into a punishment. And if so, make some corrections and try again. And keep at it, and you're going to find that logical consequences become easier and easier to use. So Dr. Michael Popkin showed up on the Oprah Winfrey Show. This is just a little excerpt from that. Oprah asked Dr. Popkin, how old do children have to be to use this discipline method? And Dr. Popkin said, one time when our first child, Megan, was about a year old, she stood up in her rocking chair. I told her that rocking chairs were for sitting and to please sit down. Not surprisingly, she just stood there looking at me with an expression that seemed to say, what are you going to do if I don't? I then offered her a choice. Megan, you can either sit in the chair or I'll have to put it away. Again, not surprisingly, she stood there and stared at me. I calmly and gently picked her up and put her on the floor, then took the rocking chair outside the gated room. She just watched. The next day, when she stood in the rocking chair, I again said that she could either sit down in the chair or I'd have to remove it from the room. She sat down. The lesson had been learned by a 1-year-old.